The opulent ballroom of the Blackwood mansion sparkled under the light of crystal chandeliers, filled with the city's most elite guests celebrating the engagement of Richard Blackwood, one of the wealthiest industrialists in the country, to the stunning socialite Victoria Sterling. The evening had been progressing flawlessly, with champagne flowing freely and congratulations echoing throughout the marble halls, when an unexpected interruption would change everything forever. As the couple stood near the grand staircase, accepting well wishes from their distinguished guests, Victoria's keen eyes caught sight of a young waiter threading his way through the crowd, balancing a silver tray with practiced precision. The moment she saw his face, her breath caught in her throat, and her champagne flute nearly slipped from her manicured fingers. The waiter, who couldn't have been more than 25, possessed striking features that seemed hauntingly familiar. The same piercing blue eyes, the identical strong jawline, and that distinctive cleft in his chin that Victoria had seen in countless photographs, lining the walls of Richard's private study. Her heart began racing as memories flooded back of the tragic story Richard had shared with her during their courtship about his son Michael, who had disappeared without a trace 15 years ago during a family camping trip in the Colorado mountains. The boy had been only 10 years old then, and despite extensive search efforts involving hundreds of volunteers, professional rescue teams, and even the FBI, no trace of him had ever been found. The loss had devastated Richard, contributing to his divorce from his first wife and driving him into a decade-long period of reclusiveness from which he had only recently emerged. Victoria's mind raced as she studied the young man's movements, noting how he carried himself with an unconscious dignity that seemed almost aristocratic despite his humble position. She watched as he navigated the crowd with surprising grace, his eyes occasionally lifting to take in the grandeur of the surroundings with what appeared to be a mixture of familiarity and longing. When their eyes met across the room, she saw something flicker in his expression, a momentary confusion, as if he too sensed some inexplicable connection. Unable to contain herself any longer, Victoria gently touched Richard's arm and whispered the words that would shatter the evening's carefully orchestrated perfection. "Darling, look at that young waiter by the piano. He looks exactly like your lost son." Richard's face immediately drained of all color as he turned to follow Victoria's gaze, his eyes searching the crowd until they landed on the young man in question. The champagne glass in his hand began to tremble visibly, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might collapse entirely. The resemblance was indeed uncanny, so striking that several nearby guests began to notice the millionaire's distress and the direction of his intense stare. The waiter, sensing the sudden attention focused on him, looked up nervously and caught Richard's gaze directly. In that electric moment of connection, something profound passed between them, an inexplicable recognition that seemed to transcend the boundaries of time and circumstance. What happened next would become the talk of high society for years to come. Richard, abandoning all pretense of social propriety, pushed through the crowd of bewildered guests, his eyes never leaving the young waiter's face. His powerful voice, usually so controlled and commanding in boardroom meetings, cracked with emotion as he called out, "Michael, is it really you?" The entire ballroom fell into a stunned silence, with hundreds of pairs of eyes following the dramatic scene unfolding before them. The waiter, whose name tag read David Morrison, stood frozen in place, his tray forgotten as he stared at the approaching millionaire with a mixture of confusion and an inexplicable sense of homecoming that he couldn't quite understand. As Richard drew closer, the physical similarities became even more apparent to everyone watching. The young man possessed not only Richard's distinctive features but also his characteristic mannerisms, the way he tilted his head slightly when concentrating, the unconscious gesture of running his hand through his hair when nervous, and, most remarkably, a small scar above his left eyebrow that Richard remembered vividly from a childhood accident when Michael had fallen from his bicycle at age 7. The crowd watched in fascination as Richard reached out with trembling hands to touch the young man's face, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered, "I've been searching for you for 15 years." David Morrison, who had been raised in a series of foster homes after being found wandering alone and confused on a highway in Nevada with no memory of his past, felt an overwhelming rush of emotions he couldn't explain. He had always known something was missing from his life, a void that no amount of searching through missing persons databases or consultations with therapists had been able to fill. As he looked into Richard's eyes, fragmented memories began surfacing like pieces of a long-lost puzzle, flashes of a grand staircase remarkably similar to the one behind him, memories of a man's strong hands teaching him to tie his shoes, and the distant echo of a voice reading bedtime stories in a room filled with toy soldiers and model airplanes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the gathering, but none were more profoundly affected than Victoria herself. She watched as her fiancé embraced the young man with desperate intensity, and she realized that her life was about to change in ways she had never anticipated. The engagement party that was meant to celebrate her upcoming marriage had instead become a reunion that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of everything she thought she knew about her future. As the truth began to unfold through tearful conversations between father and son, it became clear that Michael had suffered from traumatic amnesia following his disappearance, living for years without any memory of his privileged background or loving family. The mystery of Michael's disappearance began to unravel as fragments of his memory slowly returned throughout the evening. He had apparently been kidnapped by a desperate woman who had lost her own child and had kept him for several months, before abandoning him when the pressure of the nationwide search became too intense. The trauma of the experience had caused his young mind to completely block out his previous life as a protective mechanism. He had been placed in the foster care system under the name David Morrison, an identity created by social services when no family could be located, and had grown up believing himself to be an orphan with no past worth remembering. As the evening progressed, the engagement party transformed into something entirely different, a celebration of a family reunited against all odds. Guests who had come to congratulate Richard and Victoria on their upcoming nuptials instead found themselves witnesses to a miracle that seemed too extraordinary to believe. The catering staff, initially confused by the disruption to their carefully planned service, gradually realized they were part of something historic. The young man they had known as David, a quiet and hardworking colleague who had never spoken much about his past, was revealed to be the heir to one of the country's largest fortunes. Victoria found herself grappling with complex emotions as she watched the reunion unfold. While she was genuinely happy for Richard and overwhelmed by the miraculous nature of the discovery, she couldn't help but wonder how this development would affect their relationship and their future together. She had fallen in love with a man whose greatest tragedy was the loss of his son, and now that son was miraculously restored to him. The dynamics of their relationship would inevitably change, and she wasn't sure where that would leave her in Richard's life. Would there still be room for her in a world where his greatest wish had finally been granted? The weeks following the dramatic revelation brought even more shocking discoveries. DNA tests, while confirming that David was indeed Michael Blackwood, also revealed information that no one had anticipated. Further investigation into the circumstances of his disappearance uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Richard's business empire. It turned out that Michael's kidnapping hadn't been the random act of a disturbed woman, but rather an elaborate scheme orchestrated by Richard's former business partner, who had hoped to inherit control of the Blackwood Industries by eliminating Richard's heir. The woman who had taken Michael was merely a pawn in a larger game, paid to make the boy disappear permanently. The revelation of this betrayal sent shockwaves through the business community and led to a high-profile criminal investigation that would eventually result in multiple arrests and convictions. Richard, who had trusted his partner implicitly for decades, was devastated to learn that someone so close to him had been responsible for the greatest tragedy of his life. The discovery also explained why the initial search efforts had been mysteriously hampered by false leads and misdirected resources sabotaged from within. Richard's own organization had prevented the truth from being discovered years earlier. As Michael slowly readjusted to his true identity and began to reclaim his rightful place in his father's life and business empire, he struggled with the challenge of reconciling two completely different versions of himself. David Morrison, the humble waiter and foster child, had developed a strong work ethic and deep empathy for others who faced hardship. Michael Blackwood, the heir to vast wealth and